Good morning, everyone. Today, we are going to talk about important topics regarding the Chapter 13 entitled Balance of Payments, Debt, Financial Crisis, and Stabilization Policies. These are all interrelated topics that have a significant impact on the economic development of countries around the world. Before we begin, let us first read the overview of this chapter to know what topics will be discussed as the presentation goes on. The chapter discusses the components of the balance of payments, including current account, capital account, and financial account, and the importance of maintaining a balance between them. It also examines the causes and consequences of external debt, financial crises, and the various policies that governments can implement to stabilize their economies during such crises. Then, it emphasizes the importance of prudent macroeconomic policies, such as fiscal and monetary policies, in avoiding financial crises and promoting long-term economic growth. To start off, we will be talking about international finance and investment in developing countries. This topic sheds light on the key issues that developing countries face when it comes to managing their finances and attracting investments for the growth of their economy. It is important to understand these challenges and opportunities as developing countries strive for economic development. One crucial challenge that developing countries often face is attracting sufficient capital flows to finance their development needs. This can come in the form of foreign direct investment, in which it involves a foreign entity making investments in local business or project, remittances, which are money transfers from individuals working abroad to their home countries, and also official development assistance, which refers to financial aid provided by international governments or organizations, with all the three being able to contribute to capital flows for developing countries. Another critical issue is exchange rate volatility. Fluctuations in exchange rates can have a significant impact on developing countries' economies, affecting their trade competitiveness, investment decisions, and macroeconomic stability. This can be caused by changes in global economic conditions or fluctuations in international capital flows. How do these fluctuations in exchange rate affect developing countries' economies? What are the impacts of it? Fluctuations in exchange rates can impact developing countries' economies in several ways. A sudden depreciation of the local currency can make imports more expensive, leading to increased inflation and reduced purchasing powers. It can also affect exports, as a stronger local currency can make goods and services less competitive in international markets. Additionally, exchange rate volatility can affect investment decisions and macroeconomic stability, as it introduces uncertainty and risk into the economy. Next, we have debt burden. High levels of external debt can also pose challenges for developing countries. Accumulating debt to finance infrastructure projects or lower budget deficits may result in high interest payments, reduced government spending on social services, and increased vulnerability to financial crises. Developing countries can address the issue of high external debt by adopting several strategies. These include prudent debt management practices, such as borrowing within sustainable limits, carefully evaluating the terms and conditions of debt contracts, and diversifying sources of financing to reduce reliance on a single creditor or a single type of debt. Developing countries can also focus on promoting economic growth and generating sufficient revenues through trade, investment, and domestic resource mobilization to meet debt obligations. In cases of unsustainable debt burdens, countries can negotiate debt relief or restructuring with creditors, or seek assistance from international financial institutions to alleviate debt-related challenges. The next two issues are somewhat connected and can be combined as one. International trade is a key driver of economic development. However, developing countries most of the time, they are encountering barriers such as trade restrictions, lack of infrastructure, and limited market access. Additionally, weak governance, corruption, and lack of transparency can hinder foreign investment and erode investor confidence. So, if you may ask, what are the measures that developing countries can make to improve and create a favorable investment climate? Well, the following are some instances they can do regarding the issue. These include implementing stable macroeconomic policies, such as inflation targeting and fiscal discipline, establishing sound legal and regulatory frameworks to protect property rights and enforce contracts, improving infrastructure to reduce transaction costs and facilitate business operations, and enhancing transparency and governance to reduce corruption and increase investor confidence. Also, engaging in regional and international trade agreements can expand market access and attract foreign investment. Last on the list is financial inclusion. The reasons for its significance are as follows. First, it helps promote economic growth and reduce poverty by providing access to financial services such as savings, credit, insurance, and payment systems that enable individuals and businesses to participate in economic activities. Financial inclusion also facilitates access to formal banking services, which can help households and businesses build assets, manage risks, and invest in education, health, and productive activities. Moreover, financial inclusion promotes social inclusion by empowering marginalized groups, such as women and rural populations, to access financial resources and participate in economic decision-making. Moving on, we will now be talking about the balance of payments account. The balance of payments account, as we can see, has two sections. We have the general considerations and the hypothetical illustration between deficits and debts. Let us start with the general considerations of the balance of payments account. The balance of payments is a systematic record of all economic transactions within residents of a country and the rest of the world during a given period of time. This record helps us in understanding a country's international trade, investment, and financial flows. It provides insights into a country's economic relationships with other countries and its overall external position through the three main components of it, namely the current account, the capital account, and the financial account. The current account records transactions related to exports and imports of goods and services, such as merchandise, trade, tourism, transportation, and remittances. It also includes income from investments such as interest, dividends, and wages, as well as transfers such as foreign aid and remittances. The current account is considered to be in surplus when a country earns more from its exports than it spends on its imports, and it is considered in deficit when a country spends more on its imports than it earns from its exports. Another component is the capital account. It is the records of a country's transactions in non-financial assets, such as land, buildings, and other fixed assets. It also includes transactions related to capital transfers, such as debt forgiveness and inheritance. The capital account is relatively small compared to the current account and financial account, but it can have significant implications for a country's overall financial position. The third component is the financial account. It is the main component of balance of payments account. When capital account is about non-financial transactions, financial account, on the other hand, are transactions related to financial assets and liabilities, such as foreign direct investment, portfolio investment, and other investments. It measures the inflows and outflows of financial capital within a country and the rest of the world, over a specific period of time. A surplus in the financial account indicates that the country is attracting more foreign investment than it is investing abroad, while a deficit implies the opposite. It's important to note that the balance of payments was always balanced, main reason for its name, meaning that the sum of the current account and the capital and financial account should be equal to zero. This is because every transaction has a corresponding entry in both the current, capital, and financial account. This is achieved through various mechanisms such as adjustment in exchange rates, trade policies, capital controls, the international borrowing on lender, to ensure that the country's economic transactions with the rest of the world are in equilibrium. Now, let's move on to the hypothetical illustration between deficits and debts. A deficit in the balance of payments occurs when a country's inputs exceed its exports, or when it incurs more liabilities than assets. This results in a negative balance of payments, and the country may need to borrow or use its reserves to cover the deficit. Deficits and debts are interconnected with one another in the sense that accumulating deficits in the balance of payments can lead to a country's external debt, which refers to the total amount of money owed by a country to foreign creditors. External debt can become a burden if the country struggles to generate enough foreign exchange to repay the debt, resulting in debt servicing issues and potential negative impacts on economic development.
The issue of payment deficits. So, before anything else, let me share the definitions of my topic. A balance of payment deficit means the nation's imports more commodities, capital and services than it exports. It must borrow from other countries to pay for its imports. A deficit occurs when expenses exceeds revenues, imports exceeds exports, or liabilities exceeds assets. So as you can see in the table, current account and capital accounts are components of balanced payment. These accounts serve as the guide to measure if there's a deficit or a surplus. Current accounts are composed of export and imports of goods and services, unilateral transfers, and income receipts and payments, while capital accounts include borrowing and lending, investment, and change in foreign exchange reserves. The sum of these two accounts reflected in the balance of payments will always be zero, but according to theory, it's impossible to sustain a deficit in the balance of payments. In practice, temporary imbalances do occur because of accounting difficulties. The most obvious cause of a balance of payment deficit is called unilateral transfer. An example of unilateral transfer is US resident who sent money in the form of foreign aid to another country and did not receive anything in return. Few economists would suggest that balance of payment deficits resulting from foreign aid are a bad thing, but in the short term of balance of payment deficit isn't necessarily bad or good. It does mean that in real terms, there is more importation than exportation occurring until the value of money adjusts. Even though most economists believes that deficit isn't always bad, developing countries still needs to finance it. So, in financing the deficit on combined and current capital accounts, the country will have to draw down money from its monetary reserves. So, the international reserves are the country's balance of gold, hard currencies, and special drawing rights used to settle international transactions. This reserve serves for many purposes but are most significantly held to ensure that a central government agency has a backup funds if their national currency becomes rapidly devalues or becomes entirely insolvent. So if the country is very poor, it is likely to have a very limited stock of these reserves. So this is the Philippine foreign exchange reserves from March 2022 to February 2023. Philippines foreign exchange reserves was measured at 85.4 billion US dollars in February 2023 compared with 86.3 billion US dollars in the previous month. The top countries with the largest foreign reserves are China, Japan, Switzerland, Russia, and India.
China had by far the largest international reserves in 2022 with 3.46 trillion US dollars reserves.
So now let's talk about the possible ways to improve the balance on current account to avoid balance of payment deficit. First is promoting export expansions or limiting imports or both. In promoting export expansion, the country must concentrate on primary and secondary products export expansion. While in limiting imports, policies of import substitutions or selective tariffs and physical quotas or bans on the importations of specific consumer goods. Second is seek loans and assistance from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, but this has required that the countries follow very restrictive fiscal and monetary policies. If you can still recall, the World Bank was created as one of the Bretton Woods institutions as well as the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank was created to help Europe and Japan rebuild after World War II, and it provides financial and technical aid to the developing nations of the world, while the International Monetary Fund was established to help the countries who were affected by the Great Depression, and it is also formed to promote financial stability, international trade, high employment, and reduce poverty. So, the focus of this solution is debt and finance. Since developing countries took on a lot of debt, the World Bank created policies. These have been called stabilization policies by the IMF and termed structural adjustment by the World Bank. These two policies impose a requirement called conditionality. Conditionality is a requirement imposed by International Monetary Fund that a borrowing country undertake fiscal, monetary, and international commercial reforms as a conditions for receiving loan to resolve balance of payment difficulties. Structural adjustment loans and stabilization policies were designed to promote a fundamental restructuring of the economies of countries plagued by chronic trade and budget deficits by improving the macroeconomics policy environment with an emphasis on mobilizing domestic savings through fiscal and financial policies, improving public sectors and efficiency by stressing price-determined allocation of public investment, and improving the efficiency of public enterprises, improving the productivity of public sectors investments by liberalizing trade and domestic economic policies, and lastly, reforming institutional arrangements to support the adjustments process. So the next slide is an animated video for you to be able to understand the topic better.
Like a household that needs to get out of debt, a country with a BOP deficit needs to solve that deficit. The ways in which a country can reduce its BOP deficit revolve around switching from buying from outside to within the country, cutting its spending on imports altogether, or getting serious about selling more of its stuff abroad. To switch away from buying foreign goods is done mainly through protectionism. Countries place taxes on imports, make their currencies weaker, so as to make imports more expensive compared to domestic production. People will then start buying local goods and cut the spending on imports. One hard way is to make people poorer so that with less money on hand, they'll cut back on spending on a variety of goods fed through imports. No more fancy cheese and wine from Italy. When countries get serious about selling to the world, they need to up the ante and make only the best quality and value in the world markets. Supply-side measures to improve the quality of products. More efficiency to increase cost competitiveness.
Having summarized some basic balance of payments concepts and issues as they relate to both commodity trade and international flows of financial resources, we can briefly review some trends in the balance of payments of developing nations and then focus our attention on a detailed analysis of debt problems. Trends in balance of payments. For most developing countries, 1980 was an extraordinarily difficult period in their balance of payments accounts with the rest of the world. Prior to 1980 conventional development strategy and the developing countries operating with sizable current account deficits because imports of capital and intermediate goods were required to provide the machinery and equipment for rapid industrialization, the financing of this deficit was therefore made possible by large resource transfers in the capital account in the form of country-to-country foreign aid, direct private investment by multinational corporations, private loans by international banks to both developing country, government, and local businesses, multilateral loan from the World Bank and other international development agencies. This table is about the balances on current account of developing countries. As illustrated in this table, the balance abruptly turned negative until 2000. The reason for the decline in the current balances in the 1980s and 1990s includes a dramatic fall in commodity prices, including oil, global recession in 1981 to 1982, and 1991-1993, which caused a general contraction in world trade, increasing protectionism in the developed world against export from developing countries, and some severely overvalued exchange rates in several key developing economies. The capital account showed dramatic trend in the 1980s as a combined result of rising developing countries' debt services obligations, sharp declines in lending by international banks, and massive capital flight. Before, it has been a positive annual resource flow of 25 million to 35 billion US dollars from developed to less developed countries. Then it turned into a negative annual flow to 25 to 35 million US dollar from developing to developed world. Behind these trends, however, was the debilitating dilemma of developing countries.
A pleasant day to all of you. This is Junpachis Dipekinya, and we'll talk about the international debt crisis of 1982, which brought a significant impact on the global economy, affecting not only developing countries but also major financial institutions in the developed nations. It led to a prolonged period of economic instability and hardship, with many countries struggling to repay their debts and facing a range of economic and political challenges. So, what is external debt? External debt is a total private and public foreign debt owed by a country. The accumulation of external debt is a common phenomenon of developing countries at the stage of economic development where the supply of domestic savings is low, current account payments deficits are high, and imports of capital are needed to augment domestic resources. Prior to the early 1970s, the external debt of developing countries was relatively small. Most loans were unconcessional, which means low interest terms, and were extended for purposes of implementing development projects and expanding imports of capital goods. However, during the late 1970s and early 1980s, commercial banks began playing a large role in international lending by recycling surplus organization of the petroleum exporting countries, or OPEC, petrodollars, and issuing general purpose loans to developing countries to provide balance of payment support and expansion of export sectors. So, although foreign borrowing can be highly beneficial, providing the resources necessary to promote economic growth and development, when poorly managed, it can be very costly. In recent years, these costs have greatly outweighed the benefits for many developing nations. The main cost associated with the accumulation of a large external debt is debt service. So, what is debt service? Debt service is the payment of amortization, which means liquidation of principal and accumulated interest. It is a contractually fixed charge on domestic real income and savings. And as the size of the debt grows, or as the interest rates rise, debt service charges increases. And debt service payments must be made with foreign exchange. In other words, debt service obligations can be met only through first, export earnings, second, curtailed imports, or third, further external borrowing. So first, it is necessary to understand a fundamental concept known as the basic transfer. The basic transfer of a country is defined as the net foreign exchange inflow or outflow related to its international borrowing. The basic transfer is an important concept because it represents the amount of foreign exchange that a particular developing country is gaining or losing each year from international capital flows. As you will soon discover, the basic transfer turned very negative for developing nations during the 1980s, causing a loss of foreign exchange and a net outflow of capital. But before anything else, did you know how basic transfer is being measured? So basically, it is measured as the difference between the net capital inflow and the interest payments on the existing accumulated debt. The net capital inflow is simply the difference between the gross inflow and the amortization of past debt. So the basic transfer equation can be expressed as follows. Let the net capital inflow Fn be expressed as the rate of increase of total external debt, and let capital D represent the total accumulated foreign debt if D is the percentage rate of increase in that total debt. Because interest must be paid each year on the accumulated debt, let R equal the average rate of interest so that RD measures the total annual interest payments. So if the percentage rate of increase in the total accumulated foreign debt is greater than the average rate of interest, then basic transfer will be positive and the country will be gaining foreign exchange. However, if the percentage rate of increase in the total accumulated foreign debt is lower than the average rate of interest, the basic transfer turns negative and the nation loses foreign exchange. A serious problem can rise, however, when, first, the accumulated debt becomes very large so that its rate of increase T naturally begins to decline as amortization rises relatively to rates of new gross inflows. Second, the sources of foreign capital switch from long-term official flows on fixed, concessional terms to short-term, variable rate private banks loan at market rates that cause R to rise. Third, the country begins to experience severe balance of payments problems as commodity prices plummet and the terms of trade rapidly deteriorate. Fourth, a global recession or some other external shock, such as a jump in oil prices, a steep rise in U.S. interest rates on which variable rate private loans are based, or a sudden charge in the value of the dollar in which most debts are denominated takes place. Fifth, a loss in confidence in the ability of the developing country to repay resulting from points 2, 3, and 4 occurs, causing private international banks to cut off their flow of new lending. And sixth, a substantial flight of capital is precipitated by local residents who, for political or economic reasons, such as expectations for currency devaluation, send great sums of money out of the country to be invested in developed country financial security, real estate, and bank accounts. So how did the 1980s debt crisis originate? The seeds of 1980s debt crisis were sown in the 1974 to 1979 period when there was a virtual explosion in international lending precipitated by the first major OPEC oil price increase. By 1974, developing countries had begun playing a large role in the world economy, having aggregated growth rates of 6.6% in 1967 to 1973. Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, and Argentina in Latin America, among other nations, had begun importing heavily, especially capital goods, oil, and food. Following outward-looking development strategies, they expanded their exports aggressively. In the face of high oil prices and a world recession, in which the growth rates of industrialized countries fell from an average of 5.2 in 1967 to 1974 to an average of 2.7% for the rest of 1970s, many developing countries sought to sustain their high growth rates through increased borrowing. So although lending from official sources, particularly non-concessional lending, increased significantly, it was insufficient to meet growth needs. Furthermore, countries with an excess of imports over lagging exports were reluctant to approach official sources such as the IMF that might be subject them to painful policy adjustments. So the middle income and newly industrializing developing countries turned to commercial banks and other private lenders, which began issuing a general purpose loans to provide balance of payment support. Commercial banks holding the bulk of OPEC surplus, which had jumped from $7 billion in 1973 to $68 billion in 1974 and ultimately peaked in this period at $115 billion in 1980, and facing a low demand for capital from the slower growing industrialized countries aggressively competed in lending to developing countries on comparatively permissive and favorable terms. A combination of declining real oil prices as a result of inflation, low or negative real interest rates, and increased export earnings narrowed current accounts deficit towards the end of the decade and enabled developing countries to sustain relatively high growth rates, averaging 5.2% during 1973 to 1979 through massive borrowing. In sum, the surge in international lending following the first oil shock was largely during the periods 1974 to 1979. In a congenial economic atmosphere, it permitted developing countries to first maintain relatively high rates of growth with little debt servicing difficulty. Second, it also facilitated the recycling of huge surplus from oil exporters to oil importers through the lending activities of private international banks. And third, it helped dampen the recession in industrialized countries by providing for increased export demand on the part of developing countries. Unfortunately, this success was short lived, and in fact, the surge in international lending that occurred in 1974 to 1979 had laid the groundwork for all the problems that were to come. The second oil shock, which occurred in 1979, brought about a complete reversal of the economic conditions conducive to the success of international lending in the previous period. Now, developing countries face an abrupt increase in oil prices that added to oil import bills and affected industrial goods imports. There was also a huge increase in interest rates caused by the industrialized countries' economic stabilization policies and a decrease in export earnings for developing countries, resulting from a combination of slowed growth in more developed nations and a precipitous decline of over 20% in primary commodity export prices. Moreover, developing countries inherited from the previous period a huge debt and debt service obligation, which was made even more onerous by burgeoning interest rates and more precarious as a result of bunching of short-term maturities. Finally, during the entire period of debt accumulation, one of the most significant and persistent trends was the tremendous increase in private capital flight. Facing this critical situation, developing countries had two policy options. First is they could either curtail imports and impose restrictive fiscal and monetary measures, thus impeding growth and development objectives, or they could finance their widening current account deficits through more external borrowing. Unable and sometimes unwilling to adopt the first option as a means of solving the balance of payment crisis, many countries were forced in the 1980s to rely on the second option, borrowing even more heavily. As a result, massive debt service obligations accumulated so that countries like Nigeria, Argentina, Ecuador, and Peru were experiencing negative economic growth in the 1980s and consequently faced severe difficulties in paying even the interest on their debts out of export earnings. And now let's move forward with attempts at alleviation, macroeconomic instability, classic IMF stabilization policies, and their critics. So, the IMF stabilization program, one course of action that was increasingly but often reluctantly used by countries facing serious macroeconomic instability along with growing foreign debt obligations was to renegotiate loans with private international banks. And when we say macroeconomic instability, it is a situation in which a country has high inflation accompanied by rising budget and trade deficits and rapidly expanding money supply. So the basic idea was to stretch out the payment period for principal and interest or to obtain additional financing on more favorable terms. Typically, however, such debtor countries had to deal with the IMF before a consortium of international banks would agree to refinance or defer existing loan schedules. Relying on the IMF to impose tough stabilization policies, a process known as conditionality, before it agreed to lend funds in excess of their legal IMF quotas, the private banks interpreted successful negotiation with the IMF as a sign that borrowing countries were making serious efforts to reduce payments deficits and earn the foreign exchange needed to repay their earlier loans. So, the stabilization policies refers to a coordinated set of mostly restrictive fiscal and monetary policies aimed at reducing inflation, cutting budget deficits, and improving the balance of payments. So basically, there are four basic concepts or components to the typical IMF stabilization program. First is the abolition or liberalization of foreign exchange and import controls. Second, the valuation of the official exchange rate. Third, a stringent domestic anti-inflation program consisting of A. Control of bank credit to raise interest rates and reserve requirements. B. Control of the government deficit through curbs on spending, including in the areas of social services for the poor and staple food subsidies, along with increase in taxes and in public enterprise prices. C. Control of wage increases, in particular abolishing wage indexing. And D. Dismantling of various forms of price controls and promoting fair markets. And lastly, greater hospitality to foreign investment and the general opening up of the economy to international commerce. Because IMF policies are being imposed by an international agency that is perceived by those of the independent school to be merely an arm of the rich industrialized nations, stabilization policies are often viewed by this school as measured designed primarily to maintain the poverty and dependence of developing countries while preserving the global market structure for the international banks and private investors and speculators from the industrialized nations. Less radical observers view the IMF as neither pro-development nor anti-development but simply as an institution trying to carry out its original, if somewhat outdated, mandate to hold the global capitalist market together through the pursuit of orthodox short-term international financial policies. Its primary goal is the maintenance of an orderly international exchange system designed to, first, promote monetary cooperation, second, expand international trade, third, control inflation, fourth, encourage exchange rate stability, and fifth, help countries deal with short-run balance of payment problems. Unfortunately, in a highly unequal trading world, the balance of payments problems of many developing nations may be structural and long-term in nature, with the result that short-term stabilization policies may easily lead to long-run development crises. For example, between 1982 and 1988, the IMF strategy was tested in 28 of the 32 nations of Latin America and the Caribbean. It was clearly not working. During that period, Latin America financed $145 billion in debt payments, but at a cost of economic stagnation, rising unemployment, and a decline in per capita income of 7%. And now let's talk about tactics for debt relief. But before that, let's first define what tactics and debt relief are. When we say tactics, these are actions or strategies carefully planned to achieve a specific end. Debt relief, on the other hand, refers to measures to reduce or refinance debt in order to make it easier for the borrower to repay it. Hence, when we say tactics for debt relief, these are thoroughly considered out techniques to minimize or refinance debt to make it easier for the borrower to make the repayments. It may entail forgiving a portion of debt principal, lowering the interest rate, or consolidating several debts into a single lower interest loan. The debt crisis of the 1980s called into question the stability and very viability of the international financial system. Fears were voiced that if one or two of the major debtor countries, Brazil, Mexico, or Argentina, were to default, if a group of debtor nations were jointly to repudiate their debts by forming a debtors cartel, or if more countries followed Peru's early initiative to link debt servicing to export earnings, the economies of Western Union or Western nations rather might be seriously affected. And maybe some of you will ask what debtors cartel mean. So when we say debtors cartel, it is a group of developing country debtors who join together to bargain as a group with creditors. Going back, following the onset of that crisis, most developing countries were cut off from the international capital market. Emergency meetings between international bankers and government officials of developed nations and developing country debtors were convened in the financial capitals of the world. This was because Latin American debts alone exceeded the net assets of the largest US banks. Numerous proposals for relieving or restructuring the debt burdens of highly indebted nations have been proposed. And when we say restructuring, it is altering the terms and conditions of debt repayment, usually by lowering interest rates or extending the repayment period. This have ranged from a new allocation of special drawing rights to restructuring on better terms for debtor countries of principal payments falling due during an agreed consolidated period. Most notable have been the Paris Club arrangements, offering highly concessional conditions, the so-called Taranta terms. These bilateral arrangements for public loans permit creditor governments to choose from three alternative concessional options to generate cash flow savings for debtor countries. And the three alternative concessional options are: first, partial cancellation of up to one-third non-concessional loans; second, reduced interest rates; and third, extended 25-year maturity of payments. For commercial banks, the 1989 Brady Plan linked partial debt forgiveness for selected borrowers to IMF or World Bank financial support, guaranteeing the payment of the remaining loan as well as commitments by the indebted developing countries to adopt stringent IMF-type adjustment programs, promote free markets, welcome foreign investors, and repatriate overseas capital. In addition, there has been much discussion of debt for equity swaps. So, what do we mean by Brady Plan and debt for equity swaps? A Brady Plan is a program launched in 1989 designed to reduce the size of outstanding developing country commercial debt through private debt forgiveness procured in exchange for IMF and World Bank debt guarantees and greater adherence to the terms of conditionality. Debt for equity swap, on the other hand, is a mechanism used by indebted developing countries to reduce the real value of external debt by exchanging equity in domestic companies, stocks, or fixed interest obligations of the government, bonds for private foreign debt at a large discounts. An appealing but much less significant swap arrangement is the debt for nature swap, which means the exchange of foreign debt held by an organization for a larger quantity of domestic debt that is used to finance the preservation of a natural resource or environment in debtor country. Debt for nature swap is intended to win commitments by a developing country's government to environmental preservation of such assets. Most debt for nature swaps are carved out by non-governmental organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund or the Nature Conservancy. They purchase the debtor nation's IOU at a discount from a local bank and then restructure it into local currency payments, which are then used, say, to preserve an endangered natural resource. The problem with most proposals for debt alleviation, including debt for equity swaps, is that they require private international banks to initiate or endorse the policies. Most are unwilling to take any steps that would harm their short run balances sheets. More significant, in the absence of unilateral debt repudiation by developing countries, most proposals, except debt for nature and similar swaps, do not solve the debt problem but merely postpone the day when debts become due and so another crisis erupts. And when we say debt repudiation, it means a policy that would hurt both borrowers and lenders in both the short and the long term. And now, let's move forward to defining odious debt and HIPCs. Odious debt is a concept in the theory of international law holding that just as contracts signed under coercion are unenforceable, sovereign debt used by an undemocratic government in a manner that is contrary to the interests of its people should be deemed invalid. Heavily indebted poor countries, or HIPCs, are the group of the world's poorest and most heavily indebted countries as defined by the World Bank and the IMF, which status make them eligible for special debt relief. And HIPC initiative is the first initiative to address the problems of heavily indebted poor countries.
After looking at a country's balance of payments accounts and recent trends in developing country trade balances, we will examine the dimensions and effects of debt crisis in developing countries. As outlined, we will delve into the causes of the crisis and the challenges faced in achieving lasting recovery. Economic impacts on developing countries, differing impacts and continuing challenges across developing regions, prospects for recovery and stability, and lastly, opportunities as well as dangers. These crises are of exceptional importance because of their scope and impact on slowing the development progress of dozens of developing nations over protracted periods. And much has been learned from years of careful study of the lessons from these experiences. Let us start by understanding the causes of the global financial crisis. The financial crisis that emerged in 2008 was a severe economic downturn that had far-reaching consequences for both developed and developing countries. It had significant impacts on developing countries, including trade and investment disruptions, capital flight, exchange rate volatility, debt and financing constraints, and weaknesses in financial systems and regulations. The crisis was triggered by a complex interplay of factors, including subprime mortgages, global financial interconnectedness, and deregulation and risk-taking. Subprime mortgage crisis. The crisis originated in the United States with the collapse of the subprime mortgage market, where risky mortgages were granted to borrowers with poor credit history. This led to housing market bubble that eventually burst, causing widespread defaults on mortgage payments, and triggering a chain reaction of financial losses and instability. Global financial interconnectedness. The global financial system had become highly interconnected, with financial institutions across countries holding complex financial instruments that were tied to the U.S. housing market. When the U.S. housing market collapsed, it resulted in a contagion effect, spreading the crisis to other countries through financial linkages. Deregulation and risk-taking. Deregulation and lax regulatory oversight in the financial sector allowed for excessive risk-taking and speculative activities, including complex financial products with high levels of leverage and opacity. This further amplified the impact of the crisis and made it difficult to assess and manage risk effectively. The global financial crisis had significant implications for developing countries, posing several challenges to achieving lasting recovery. Some of the challenges include trade and investment disruptions, capital flight and exchange rate volatility, debt and financing constraints, and weak financial systems and regulation. Trade and investment disruptions. The crisis led to a global economic slowdown, resulting in reduced demand for goods and services from developing countries, declining export revenues, and decreasing foreign and direct investment. This in turn impacted their economic growth and development prospects. Capital flight and exchange rate volatility. Developing countries experienced capital flight as investors pulled out their investments, leading to exchange rate volatility, currency devaluations, and inflationary pressures. This created uncertainties in financial markets and posed challenges for monetary and fiscal policy management, debt and financing constraints. Developing countries face increased borrowing costs and reduced access to credit, making it difficult to finance their development projects and meet their debt obligations. Many countries had to resort to austerity measures and fiscal tightening, which could hamper social spending and poverty reduction efforts. Weak financial systems and regulation. Developing countries with weak financial systems were particularly vulnerable to the impacts of the crisis. The crisis exposed weaknesses in financial governance, risk management, and regulatory oversight, leading to increased financial instability and vulnerability to external shocks. These weaknesses can be addressed by strengthening regulatory frameworks, improving transparency and accountability, and enhancing capacity building in financial institutions.
And now let's proceed with economic impacts of the crisis on the developing countries. Basically, we have here 9 areas of impacts. First is the economic growth. Second is the exports. Third is foreign investment inflows. Fourth is developing countries' stock markets. Fifth is aid. Sixth is the distribution of influence among developing countries. Seventh, worker remittances. Eighth, poverty. And ninth, health and education. And now let's dive into understanding each area. So economic growth is an increase in the production of economic goods and services compared from one period to another. In 2007, the first half of 2008, developing countries were affected less than developed countries. But in the second half of 2008, the impact was quite severe in most developing regions, continuing to 2009. Second, exports. These are goods and services produced in one country but supplied to buyers in another. Exports fell drastically in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. World trade volumes fell 14.4% in 2009, the largest drop in decades, but then rebounded strongly before returning to modest growth from 2011. Developed countries' austerity programs were a factor in their declining trade deficits. New trade records in asset prices brought with it some fears of the temporary return of the bubble economy, precipitating an even more worse crisis than last time, with a larger impact on exports, but there is no more consensus on the extent to which new bubbles, if any, are forming. With the outlook doubtful for rapid increases in export to developed countries, the emphasis has turned to trade among developing countries. Next is the foreign investment inflows. These are the value of inward direct investment made by the resident investors in the reporting economy, including reinvested earnings and intracompany loans, net of repatriation of capital and repayment of loans. A United Nations Conference on Trade and Development study concluded that the global crisis curtailed the funding available for FDI and noted that FDI inflows to developing and transition economies declined by 27% to $548 billion in 2009, following 6 years of uninterrupted growth. While their FDI contracted, this grouping appeared more resilient to the crisis than developed countries. The UNCTAD 2020 World Investment Report concluded that investments from emerging investors proved more resilient than FDI from developed countries. And now, let's proceed with developing country stock markets. This is the economy of a developing nation that is becoming more engaged with global market as it grows. At first, a flight to safety caused the volatility of developing country stock markets to increase greatly, but prices subsequently resumed their rise and markets deepened in a few rapidly growing economies, notably China and India. Next, aid. Aid is, from the perspective of governments, a voluntary transfer of resources from one country to another. Aid has risen modestly since 2001, but only a modest portion of the promised increases has been delivered, most likely due in the part to the impact of the crisis and subsequent recessions in the high-income donor countries. But as aid remained below historical levels, other financial flows such as worker remittances, FDI, and portfolio investment flows increased by many more than the declines in aid. And next, the distribution of influence among developing countries. The ideas, values, and or aesthetics that are promoted or modeled by an organization, a nation, a region, or a group of people and influence how others in a certain demographic behave and think. Examples include the American form of government, British colonialism, and Catholic missionaries. Even as the crisis accelerated, some developing countries, most notably China, but also countries such as Brazil, found that they had increased global influence. But the growing economic inequality among developing nations became even sharper. And now let's move forward with the work remittances, which refers to the transfer made by migrants employed and resident in a compiling economy to their relatives in their country of origin. Remittances to developing countries from migrant workers had reached a record $336 billion in 2008, though less than 10% of this went to the low-income countries. But this fell significantly in the aftermath of the crisis, followed by significant recovery. These remittances have been an important factor in the progress of poverty reduction in recent years, and the consequences will grow if remittances do not pick up more quickly. Moving forward, let's talk about poverty. In developing countries, the crisis affected earnings more than employment. In the aftermath of the crisis, lower growth reduced the rate of poverty reduction in most developing countries, and in many countries, the number of people living in poverty increased. One of the most important impacts was a slowdown in the rate of hunger reduction. The 2010 Millennium Development Goals report estimated that poverty rates will be slightly higher in 2015 and even beyond to 2020 than they would have been had the world economy grown steadily at its pre-crisis phase. And for the last one, health and education. These are the two main types of investments in human capital that societies make. To a large extent, they predict the economic well-being of the entire society and the relative well-being of its individual members. Judd Friedman and Norbert Shady used household data to develop an economic model to project infant deaths and report that our estimates suggest that there will be on the order of 30,000 to 50,000 excess deaths in Africa in 2009, deaths that would not have taken place had the subprime crisis which began in the United States not spread to African countries. They find that the bulk of the additional children who will die is likely to be found among poorer households in rural areas and those with lower educational levels, and is concentrated among girls. Impacts generally differ across countries. Another 2010 study projected deteriorations specifically in schooling, child labor, and access to health services in Burkina Faso and on hunger in Ghana.
So the next subtopic is differing impacts and continuing challenges across developing regions. So first is Asia. During the period from September 2008 to March 2009, there was a dramatic slowdown in some cases and major reversal of the high export growth and GDP growth that the East Asian region, including China. China had come to take for granted. The subsequent rebound was strong but uneven. The next country is China. China weathered the initial crisis well, partly due to its own massive stimulus package of almost 600 billion US dollar, a much higher share of GDP than the corresponding US package of about 800 billion US dollar. The government announced a new strategy of a greater reliance on domestic demand for growth. But hallmarks of a housing market and commercial property bubble are being reported in China. The bursting of such a bubble would probably have a significant impact on the global economy. The infrastructure and other investment levels have also been at historically unprecedented levels, with nearly half of output represented in investment in official statistics, but a significant fraction of it apparently yielding low returns. China's economic policymakers appear focused on decreasing reliance on basic exports that rely on processing of imports for modest value added before the export. Improving domestic processing and reliance might also positively affect what is widely viewed as currency imbalance.
Moreover, China's growth has been decelerating from unsustainable levels that have continued longer than previously expected, partly as a result of the boost from the post-crisis stimulus package and subsequent lending policies. Further in deceleration of growth in China seems likely. One reason is that total debt rose very rapidly from about 130% of GDP in 2008 to about 200% in 2013. A particular concern is off-the-book local government debt, which the National Audit Office of China reported has skyrocketed to almost 3 trillion US dollars in the 3 years to June 2013. As growth slows further in China, export earnings from developing country exports to China may decrease.
The five high-income economies in the region, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong remains dependent on exports for growth by global standards, and all experience substantial declines in exports. Expressed in US dollars, exports dropped by 25% with GDP declining between 15 and 30% in the second half of 2008 and first half of 2009. However, just as the scope of the shock was unanticipated, the scale of the subsequent rebound was also surprising. Recovery in middle and low-income countries including Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Thailand was also strong. Three of these five countries reported negative growth after the crisis, but no greater a decline than 2.7%. Demand from China helped raise exports from East and Southeast Asia overall. The World Bank noted that China's infrastructure outlays also underpin demand for regional and raw materials used in construction from different countries. The role of China in the region has continued to grow. However, tensions over that role were a factor in the push for a new Trans-Pacific Partnership and smaller regional agreements. In the 2011 to 2013 period, growth continued among countries in this region but with wide variations. Let's proceed to India. India, initially, the Indian economy weathered the financial crisis relatively well. During the crisis, the central government fiscal deficit rose to 7% of GDP. This was in part a planned stimulus to maintain growth during the crisis period. Like most other countries that ran up the fiscal deficit after the crisis, leaders and economic policymakers in India now wish to reduce the deficit substantially, if not run a compensating fiscal surplus for time. On the other hand, expenditures on poverty programs are increasing, with new government nutrition programs to have a much expanded reach. Some commentators found this is a very hopeful sign given the continued severity of poverty in general and malnutrition in particular still prevalent in India. The opposition criticized these programs as a political move intended to influence the 2014 general elections. The manufacturing sector had a full period of decline. Also viewed as a concern for the future was India's growing dependence on energy imports. Even today, however, over half of the labor force in India works in agriculture. Barriers to global finance in India have helped insulate India's still relatively closed economy, but this also suggests there are other untapped gains from trade. India is working to develop more active economic and political relationships with developing countries in Asia and with such nations as Brazil and South Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Despite the concerns that the crisis would quickly lead to a repeat of past crises in the region, many countries weathered the initial shocks relatively well. Mexico suffered an economic contraction of about 6.5% in 2009 in the wake of the crisis due to the close economic ties in the United States and amplified by the outbreak of the H1N1 flu virus or swine flu. When the peso was driven to records lows in December 2008, Mexican firms suffered foreign derivative losses. While growth rose to about 5% in 2010, it fell back to less than 4% in both 2011 and 2012. While growth of remittances bounced back and remained strong in most regions, they stayed weak in Latin America and the Caribbean, where growth decelerated due to U.S. economic weakness and policy changes. Argentina was hit hard by the crisis, rebounded very strongly in 2010 and 2011, but then slipped back into slow GDP growth, less than 2% in 2012. Brazil at first weathered the crisis well, with 6% growth in 2007 and 5% growth in 2008. In no small part due to the boost from commodity exports, particularly to China. China is now their largest trading partner. Africa. Low levels of trade, coupled with relatively high commodity prices for its exports, in some ways helped insulate sub-Saharan Africa from the brunt of the crisis. The problem of educated unemployment was exacerbated as new university graduates in the region were having even more difficulty than usual in finding employment that matched their qualifications. This is also true in North Africa and in the Middle East, where it was a factor in the Arab Spring revolts. Although commodity prices were off their peaks, they remained relatively high due in significant measure to demand from Asia, and commodity export continued to fuel growth. Middle East and North Africa. Recovery has been very sluggish in much of the Middle East and North Africa region as growth has continued to be slow in the 2011 to 2013 period in several important countries. This is despite the fact that governments in the region undertook expansionary fiscal policies. In 2013 in Egypt, the new turmoil also created economic and political uncertainty and led to a further drop in investment and tourism. The economic breakdown in Syria has struck the brutality of its civil war. Even in countries that have not experienced turmoil, some spillovers, including investor perceptions, have led to falls in economy activity. On the other hand, oil exporters have been benefited from prevailing relatively high oil prices, even prospects for recovery and stability. In the years following the crisis, international financial institutions and many private forecasters predicted that developing countries would lead a global recovery, which would be a milestone in the history of development. The World Bank, along with the IMF and other forecasters, indicated that risks are to the downside. Indeed, there are at least five reasons for caution. The first one is after growth in the United States, Europe and Japan remained significantly below historical levels for 6 years following the crisis, and there were doubts that faster growth could resume in most OECD countries for some time to come. Even given that recessions after financial crises historically were deeper and longer lasting than other downturns, large trade deficits of high-income countries, most notably but not only in the United States, have fallen and seem unlikely to come close to previous heights. The trade balance for Europe as a whole is moving from deficit to surplus. This makes dependence on exports to high-income countries, including the United States, a shaky foundation at present on which to build growth. If growth in major middle-income countries continues to slow significantly in line with forecasts, this puts export-led growth as a development model at a greater risk. Second, fiscal deficits have been high in virtually all high-income OECD countries, but falling rapidly, reducing demand. Deficits are unlikely to return to previous levels, but in most countries, government debt is now much higher than before the crisis. There is less room for fiscal policy to respond with stimulus in the event of another crisis. Third, market perceptions of the risk of sovereign default are high, though in a historic reversal, less so for developing countries on average than for a number of developed countries. A default or major debt restructuring in Europe could threaten the solvency of banks beyond this group, with the potential for a return to broader crisis. Fourth, the risk of deflation which occurred during the Great Depression and in Japan during its lost decade remains higher than normal. This compounds any other difficulties of emerging from a new crisis. The quantitative easing in the United States was a response to the risk, but it also led to lower value of the dollar, a major concern of developing country exporters. The last one is benefits of the exporting manufacturers to high-income countries are still present, but the opportunity to do so is threatened due to very slow growth, worsened credit constraints, and perhaps even an increase in disguised protectionism in the developed countries. Such conditions may lead to reduced growth in developing countries and a reduced pace of technology transfers from developed to developing countries. One indicator to watch over the next few years is whether developing countries can continue to rely more on exports to each other, as well as internally generated demand. If they can build on recent trends and make this transition, development may be more rapid and setbacks less likely than has been expected during the crisis or in the decades preceding it. Opportunities as well as dangers. In Chinese symbols, crisis is formed from the symbols for two other words: wei, a symbol for danger or great peril, and ji, which can serve as a symbol of opportunity or turning point. Like many difficult translations, scholars differ on what ji means in this usage, but it introduces a question. Throughout the developing world, the unfolding crisis and its aftershocks were viewed with fear. What would happen to markets for their vital exports? But there is no doubt that many policymakers in China and in other fast-growing developing nations quickly came also to view the crisis as a great opportunity and a critical turning point. As the Group 8 lost some of its central role, this was paralleled by a relative rise of the Group 20, a broader group of nations including leading developing countries whose prominence in the 2008 and 2009 meetings to respond to the crisis was a historic event in the economic and political relations between developed and developing worlds. However, after the worst of the crisis abated, the sustainability of a prominent Group 20 role was unclear. But hopes have been dimmed in many parts of the developing world for open and stable access to developed country. Since 2008 crisis, politicians have considered it inexpedient to be viewed as extending concessions on trade. The crisis also revealed to developing countries that despite the assurances of WTO rules, the United States, the European Union, and other advanced regions could effectively get away with reverting to protectionism, at least in the short run when they found out it to be politically expedient. Domestic demand-led growth and greater reliance on trade between developing countries will also be pursued. Overall, recovery in the developing world from the global financial crisis proved far more rapid than many analysts had originally predicted, even as it was worse than expected for many developed countries, particularly in Europe. Yet, as we have seen, many questions remain about the strength and stability of economic growth and development in the coming.
And to give you a brief summary of the topic, kindly watch and listen to the video clip next to the slide.
In this video, we will explore the causes and consequences of the international debt crisis of 1982, as well as the lessons learned from this pivotal moment in global economic history. So, sit back, relax, and let's dive into the world of international finance and economics. To understand the international debt crisis of 1982, we need to first look at the economic conditions that prevailed during the 1970s. This decade was marked by an increase in oil prices, which led to a massive influx of petrodollars into the global economy. Banks in developed nations, particularly in the United States, were eager to lend this newly available money to developing countries that were looking to finance infrastructure projects and other development initiatives. As a result, many developing countries borrowed heavily from international banks, often in the form of US dollar-denominated loans. These loans were attractive due to their low interest rates and long repayment periods, but they also exposed borrowing countries to the risks of currency fluctuations and interest rate changes. By the early 1980s, interest rates in the United States have begun to rise, making it more expensive for developing countries to service their debt. Additionally, a strong US dollar made it difficult for borrowing countries to repay their loans in their own currencies, which had weakened in value. This led to a significant increase in debt servicing costs for developing countries, and many were unable to make their payments. As countries began to default on their loans, banks in developed nations faced the prospect of massive losses. This, in turn, led to a credit crunch in the global financial system, as banks became reluctant to lend to each other or to developing countries. The international debt crisis of 1982 had a profound impact on the global economy. Many developing countries were forced to implement austerity measures to reduce their debt burdens, leading to social unrest and political instability. Some countries even saw their economies contract sharply, with high inflation and unemployment rates. In response to the crisis, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and other international organizations developed a range of policy measures designed to help countries manage their debt and return to economic stability. These measures included debt rescheduling and restructuring, as well as the implementation of structural adjustment programs aimed at improving economic efficiency and reducing government spending. Today, the international debt crisis of 1982 serves as a cautionary tale about the risks of excessive borrowing and the need for responsible lending practices. It also highlights the importance of international cooperation and coordination in managing global economic challenges.